So today we're going to talk about the different cell types we find in the nervous system, and then kind of just a little introduction to some of the physiology of the nervous system. And then on Friday, we'll dive deeper into how action potentials work and other membrane potentials. And so, yeah, let's start out with the cell types here first. So as far as nervous tissue, remember this is our last type of tissue, right? We talked about epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and the fourth type was nervous tissue. So this is really our fourth type of tissue here. There's two primary cell types. There's neuroglial cells and there's neurons, right? So these are also just known as glial cells. So glial cells, their primary functions are here. So actual just physical support of neurons, kind of holding them in place, giving them structural support. Also helpful in their development, and then just overall neuron health. Okay, and then neurons themselves are the cells that actually transmit the electrical signals. Those could be within the nervous system, right? Neuron to neuron communication, but it could also be outside of the nervous system, controlling muscle and glands, or could be afferent signals coming back to communicate information about the periphery to the central nervous system. So we're going to look at each of the glial cell types, and then we'll look at the neurons a little bit and look at what they do, and then get a little bit of the general function overall of the nervous system. Everybody got that? Give me another sec to finish writing that down. Okay. So we got it. Okay. All right. So let's start with the first glial cell type, which is called the Schwann cells. Okay. So Schwann cells we find in the PNS, referring to the peripheral nervous system, not the parasympathetic nervous system. But yeah, so peripheral nervous system is where we find Schwann cells, and they're surrounding nerve fibers all throughout our peripheral nervous system. Okay, so these are the cells that make the myelin sheath. They also can help regenerate damaged cells, provide that insulation. That's what the myelin does. And by having that insulation, that makes signals travel a lot faster on neurons. So myelinated axons send action potentials way faster than unmyelinated axons do. Okay, and as you can see there, it's a real cell. It's not just like a coating. It actually has a nucleus, has a cell membrane. So it's a real cell that's wrapped around. And so we have a bunch of these types of cells around a single axon. Axons are really long, like we talked about, right? So thousands and thousands and thousands of these on a single axon. Okay, so Schwann cells wrap themselves around, and this kind of shows the process of developing myelin around an axon. It starts as just a single wrapping around. You can see the nucleus there, and then it just starts winding itself around tighter and tighter and tighter until it gets to this kind of state, and it squeezes itself so tight on there that all the cytoplasm or the fluid inside the cell kind of squeezes its way to the outside. And so then the inner wrapping layers are really just the cell membrane, right? And what are cell membranes made out of? Remember? It's the primary thing. What did you say, kid? Your mouth. Phospholipids, there we go. Yeah, so lipids, right? So lipids are the thing that create myelin sheath, right? Yeah, we'll talk about a little bit more too, but lipids are not very good conductors of electricity. They're really bad conductors of electricity, right? So that means they're good resistors of electricity. They don't allow electricity to flow through them. Okay, so when we think of wire like that we might see in our wall, or a wire in some little electrical device, what typically is wrapped around the end of that, or the outside of that wire? Rubber or plastic, right? Same idea. That's a very bad conductor of electricity. So it actually prevents the electricity from going outside of the metal part on the inside, right? So we have a good conductor on the inside, bad conductor on the outside. Same thing with our neurons, okay? The good conductor inside of those wires is metal, right? Copper is a really good conductor of electricity. Bad conductor is plastic or the metal or the rubber on the outside. With our neurons, the good conductor on the inside is what? What's inside all of our cells? What's inside that axon? What are we made up of? 70% of us is water. That's it, right? So it's water on the inside. Water is a really good conductor of electricity, right? And then on the outside is this fat layer, right? A lipid layer that doesn't allow the electricity to spread. It just makes it stay right inside. So what that allows for us is this little situation up here shown in this GIF, which is called saltatory conduction or saltatory transduction, which pretty much means we can, when the electrical signal is passing through there, when it gets under the myelinated part, it can kind of just skip through there. It doesn't need to be recharged. It only needs to be recharged at the little spots between the unmyelinated or the little unmyelinated parts, like right here and right here, right? So really what this ends up looking like is that electrical signal can kind of just skip from one node. Those are called nodes where you don't have myelin, and it makes that signal just go through that insulated part really fast, get recharged in that node, then skip to the next part really fast, get recharged again, skip to the next part. That's called saltatory conduction or saltatory transduction. That's all enabled because of this myelin sheath. Myelin being a really good resistor of electricity, doesn't let that electricity spread out, just stays right down the center. So that's really the purpose of the myelin sheath. Questions on that at all? Okay. All right, so that's our first one that we find in the peripheral nervous system. Now, another one in the peripheral nervous system is called satellite cells. Okay, satellite cells are located in ganglia. So these, like we talked about last time, the dorsal root ganglion, these are little areas where we have a bunch of cell bodies. Okay, and so they surround the cell bodies. We see them right there, all these little satellite cells surrounding. We don't really know exactly what these guys are doing. Okay, some of the things we're not quite sure. So we're not 100% sure of their function. We know there's some kind of support being provided to the neurons physically and probably just with the health of the cell as well, but we don't know exactly why they're there. But those are satellite cells we find wrapped around these cell bodies of neurons in those ganglia. Okay. All right. And now we move to the ones we find in the CNS, right? Central nervous system. These ones are called oligodendrocytes. Okay. So we find these on the axons of CNS neurons. So these are just like the Schwann cells because they create myelin, but they do it in the central nervous system instead of the peripheral nervous system. And they're different because they branch out and they connect to a bunch of neurons at the same time. Whereas the Schwann cells are just wrapping around one axon at a time. We can see here that this one has multiple arms reaching to different axons and connecting and providing myelin to a bunch of them. Okay, so they branch and to many axons, up to 50 by one cell. And then that got a little bit pushed underneath that image, but they provide insulation just like the Schwann cells do. Okay, next one in the CNS is called astrocytes. Okay, astrocytes are the most abundant glial cell in the nervous system. So we have lots and lots of these astrocytes. Their main role is to wrap around capillaries in the central nervous system. And they have these little, the little extensions are called feet, and their feet kind of grab onto the capillaries and wrap completely around them. And they form a nice seal around the capillaries. And so their primary job is to help form the blood-brain barrier. Okay, the blood-brain barrier is a unique feature of the brain where we don't allow direct contact from our, we don't allow our blood to be in direct contact with our brain cells. Okay, so there's this extra layer of protection that the brain gets to kind of decide what's allowed to come in and what's not allowed to come in. And that's the blood-brain barrier. And the astrocytes are the primary thing that helps us create that blood-brain barrier. Okay, they also help bring nutrients out of the bloodstream to the neurons. They also help with repairing neurons. And then just by the way that they're connecting to neurons and capillaries, they help support neurons and give them structural support too. Okay, so that's astrocytes. And then we've got microglial cells. Microglial cells, we find them in the CNS as well. These are important for monitoring neuron health, but these are really the immune system of the central nervous system, because since we don't have our blood doesn't have direct access to the central nervous system, we have to have some other cells that are just resident cells in the brain that can provide some of that immune support. And so that's what these cells do. They're phagocytic cells, but they're specifically found only in the nervous system, and they don't need to get there via the blood. They're just there providing that immune support. So microglial cells. And then lastly, we have these cells called ependymal cells. And we find these in the central nervous system as well, but they line the cavities of our brain. Our brains have kind of these open areas that are full of fluid called ventricles. And those ventricles are lined by these ependymal cells, which have cilia on them. And their primary job is to secrete the fluid that we talked about before, how our brain is kind of floating, right? We got that fluid in our cerebral or going through our spinal cord as well. That's called cerebral spinal fluid, or CSF. And the ependymal cells are the ones that secrete that fluid, and they keep it circulating by the cilia, kind of moving it around, and we're constantly replenishing and replacing that fluid. And so the ependymal cells' primary job is to do that. Okay, so yeah, let's go ahead and do this question here. Talk with the people next to you, make sure you're on the same page, and send that in when you're ready.
I know. So nice homework.
Is that really?
Oh, man. All right, about 10 more seconds. Go ahead and send something in here if you haven't yet. A couple more people. All right, looks like we got just about everybody. All right, so 93% of you are saying D. So it's the Schwann cells that create the myelin in the peripheral nervous system, whereas the oligodendrocytes create the myelin in the central nervous system. Good. Perfect. Okay. All right, let's do just a little bit of a summary of what we just talked about. So go ahead and fill this in, talk this through with the people around you, and then you can use this slide to label those different cells. And you can send in this question on your clickers when you're done. Go ahead. Let's work on that for a couple minutes.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so once you get that filled in, make sure you're labeling this image and then sending in that question there on your clickers.
Oh.
And the mold. All right, so go ahead and send in that answer there for the question on the next slide, and make sure you hit the send button. All right, good. Looks like we got everybody there. Okay, let's go ahead and walk through this one here first. So which of the two that we talked about that you find in the peripheral nervous system? Schwann, and what was the other one? Satellite. Yeah, satellites. I have one L or two? Two L's. Thank you. Okay, and then the other three, so oligodendrocytes, astrocytes, or other four, microglial and ependymal cells, all in the central nervous system. Okay, the two that form the myelin sheath are Schwann and oligodendrocytes. Okay, general structural support. Which ones did you guys put here? Yeah, astrocytes help with this. And any other ones? Yeah, satellite cells, maybe, right? We're not really sure what they're doing, but probably. Okay. The ones that help us secrete that cerebral spinal fluid, which ones are those? Yeah, so those are the ependymal cells. Okay, and then the ones that are kind of the immune system of the central of the nervous system are microglial cells. Good. Okay. Any questions on those? All right, then let's look at this here. So A, the one that's anchoring neurons and blood vessels, regulating the extracellular environment. What was A? Went to these guys here. Yeah, astrocytes. And then B, creating some myelin there in the central nervous system. What would those ones be? No one wants to say that word. Let's say it all together. Oligodendrocyte. Can we say it?
Oligodendrocyte.
There it is. Yeah, it's one that kind of does, you can actually sound it out, even though it's a really strange word. Okay, oligodendrocyte. And then C, got these little guys here. What's that? Yeah, microglial. And then lastly, those ependymal cells. Most of you, at least 91% of you, put D for this question, which is correct. Okay, and then we got two in the peripheral nervous system, right? Which one's E? Schwann cells, and then F, satellite. Good. Got it. Okay. Any questions about those glial cells? Okay, so the vast majority of our nervous system is neurons, right? But we also have all these other cells that do help support the neurons and play some other functions for us. Okay, well, let's talk about the neurons then. Okay, so neurons have kind of three primary regions to them. Okay, the first is the soma, that's the cell body. All right, so we can see that here. That is the soma. This contains obviously the nucleus, all the other organelles that we would typically find in a cell. They have a very specialized rough endoplasmic reticulum, and that's known as the Nissl body or Nissl bodies that we find within neurons. Again, that little question mark is supposed to be an arrow, another one that I missed. But yeah, most proteins for neurons are made way up there in the soma, right? And we talked about this very early on in the semester, that a lot of those proteins need to be carried all the way down to the very end of that neuron, like structural proteins that help create the neuron itself. Some neurotransmitters that are released down there at the end of the axon are also carried all the way down to be released down there. So yeah, so most things are carried down via what's called axonal transport on these little train tracks, pretty much those little motor proteins. We watched that little video of very early on in the semester. And that moves about 15 inches a day, right, on those little microtubules. So things are just constantly traveling back and forth, up and down axons of neurons throughout the life of a neuron. And one of the we'll talk about it again, but one of the primary pathologies in Alzheimer's disease is destruction of microtubules, which doesn't allow for signals to be sent down neurons anymore, doesn't allow for neurons to be healthy, and they eventually just die if they can't send things back and forth on those microtubules. All right, so that's the soma there. The dendrite is going to be the receptive portions, these little, it's kind of really the afferent part of it, if we were going to say it that way. But the bottom line is this is what's receiving input from the outside and then going to the soma. Okay, so these are very highly branched, very short compared to the other side. Okay, and then the other side is the axon, right? So that's typically one very long cellular extension, only one per cell. Typically, we'll see some exceptions of that in a second. These are very long. Most of them kind of branch at the end to some extent. We have a special region in the very beginning of it, right around this region, called the axon hillock. This is where our action potentials, APs, begin. Okay, and so the purpose of the axon is to send signals away from the cell body, away from the soma, towards whatever target tissue that neuron is trying to communicate with. Okay, so the next slide just has you label those different structures on the neuron. So if you're done, feel free to flip over there and start labeling those structures there. Okay, and then you can send in the letter that would answer that question there. Structure responsible for sending signals towards the soma of this neuron here. Say it again. Sorry.
Node of Ram VA.
Node of Ram VA, yeah.
Is that what it is?
E. I think it's just pointing to the axon itself there. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah, it's
Okay,
French.
look like X or that was pointing to that.
Myelin. Yeah, probably that was probably myelin or Schwann cell, one of the two. Yeah. Yeah. Mhm.
I've just thought there's
You don't have this slide, huh? Oh, you do? Okay. I was like, wait, did I forget? Did I mess that up? Okay. All right, so go ahead and send that in. If you haven't yet, make sure to hit the send button. Whenever there's more than E as a possibility, do the short answer types, and you got to hit send. Okay, I think there's about, a few more of you. There we go. Looks like mostly everybody. Okay, so about 79% of you are saying A. That's the most popular one there. And what do we call those guys? Dendrites. That's it. Absolutely. That's the receptive portion of the neuron. That's what's receiving signals from other neurons. All right, this is really what's happening. This is our whole central nervous system for the most part, is neuron to neuron communication, right? So we have an axon of another one coming and interacting here, probably another one here, right? Many, many axons interacting with this one individual neuron to modulate the signal that it sends out to another area of the brain. And that's really what's going on for the most part all throughout our central nervous system. For example, we have on average, every motor neuron that goes down to control a skeletal muscle for us is interacted with by about 10,000 neurons before it actually gets its signal to our muscle. right? And so when we think about like, oh, it's just a simple like send an action potential down that motor neuron, it contracts. It's been modulated around 10,000 times before that signal actually hits our muscle to make it the exact right level of contraction, the exact right level of strength that we need, right? So the complexity of that is kind of mind blowing for sure. But that is how it works. Okay, so A is the dendrites. B, what do we call B? The soma, yeah, or cell body. Okay, C is obviously just the nucleus there. What's that special name for the rough ER there in D? Yeah, Nissl bodies. Okay, and then we see E. That is what? Yeah, so that's just the axon, right? It's just pointing kind of between the myelin sheaths to the axon itself. And then F is the myelin sheath created there by those Schwann cells. Okay, and then G is that special initial region of the axons where the action potential start. What was that called? Yeah, axon hillock. Right, there we go. And you can see those little neurofibrils. Some of those are microtubules that create those little tracks for things to travel up and down the neuron there in that image. Okay, so it's kind of the basic structure of a neuron. Any questions about that? Okay, so one way that we can kind of classify neurons is by their structure. Okay, and yeah, the little text box was kind of in the way there. I just noticed that right before class, so I moved it down here. So yours in a little bit different spot. But we pretty much have three primary structural types of neurons, and those are shown here. So we have multipolar neurons, bipolar neurons, and unipolar neurons. Okay, and this, what's about to uncover, just tells you a little bit of information about that. So the multipolar ones are the most typical type, right? These are the standard neurons that we have in our central nervous system, in our brain. Okay, so they have an axon on one side and then dendrites on the other side, and lots of dendrites, right? That's a little bit better image of what dendrites actually look like, how much branching there is, how many different extensions there are. And then we have neurons, other axons connecting to all those different dendrites, right? Bipolar are somewhat rare. You'll talk about some next semester in Bio 1040 when we talk about the eyeball. Okay, some of the key neurons inside of our retina are bipolar neurons. Okay, so they kind of have these two extensions on, or extension on both sides going in both directions. And then unipolar, these are pretty typical neurons for the sensory neurons in the peripheral nervous system. And we looked at these are the ones that have the cell body in the middle, right, in that ganglion. And then we have one axon going back to the spinal cord, and then the other axon going back out to where the receptor is to receive whatever signal that is. So those are the ones we looked at coming out of the spinal cord last class. Okay, so those are known as the dorsal root ganglia cells. Okay. So that's kind of our structural classification of neurons. Give you guys a sec to finish writing that down. Take your time. Right. Raise your hand if you need another sec. Okay. All right. Okay, so that's the structural classification. Another way to classify neurons is by what they do, right? So functional classification, we've kind of already looked at these, right? We have neurons that are sensory, right? They only send a signal from the PNS to the CNS, right? So from the periphery back to the central nervous system. Or we have motor neurons, ones that send the signal from the CNS to the peripheral nervous system. So that's it. We also call those efferent, right? We call the sensory ones afferent. Okay, but then actually the vast majority of our neurons are neither one of those two. The vast majority are interneurons, right? Neurons that communicate with each other. right? Because we have it's around 100 billion neurons in our brain. And that's where the vast majority of all of our neurons are. And most of those are all interneurons, right? Communicating with each other. So those are that's just neuron to neuron communication. Okay. Questions about any of that? All right, so that's just a little bit of an overview of the different cell types in the nervous system. Now we're going to dive into some kind of basic principles of electricity to help us understand how electrical signals work in the body. Okay, so the first principle we need to look at is one called voltage. Okay, so voltage is defined as a charge difference between two locations. Okay, and it's going to be measured in volts, or in the body is typically going to be millivolts because we're dealing with smaller units. Okay, and this is kind of the potential energy side of electricity, right? So when we look at a battery, when you see a battery like this, what do you guys typically call that around your house? Everybody call them like a 9-volt battery? Does anybody have that terminology in their family? Like, oh, I need a 9-volt battery for that. Is that somewhat familiar? Maybe some, but not many. Okay. Maybe I'm old. I must be old then. Okay. Definitely old, but okay. So smoke detectors typically have these kind of batteries in them. Maybe you've seen your dad going around when the smoke detector starts beeping, you're like, what is that little beep sound? You got to put a new battery in. It's typically these 9-volt batteries. But anyway, so that's it's referring to the difference in charge between this pole and this pole. There's 9 volts of potential energy between one side and the other. Has anybody ever stuck their tongue on one of those batteries? Does that also date me? Okay, a couple people have done that. Okay, that's good. I'm not the only one. Okay, it shocks you when you do that. Okay, because you're connecting those two poles, right? And you're sending 9 volts of electricity into your tongue, and there's water on your tongue, so that's going to make it conduct electricity. Okay, try it out. It won't hurt you, but it does feel kind of weird. Yeah, but yeah, so that's it. So that's really what that is. We have 9 volts of potential energy between as the difference between those two sides. Right. This is what an EKG measures. EKG measures voltage, right? It measures charge difference between two locations, wherever those pads are, right? It's what's the charge difference between those two locations. In the body, if we look at a neuron, right? We talked about resting membrane potential, where the inside of our cells is much more negative and the outside is more positive. That negative 70 millivolts, which is our resting membrane potential, that's just the voltage between the two, right? That's the charge difference between inside and outside of the cell. Okay, so that's our potential energy. That's kind of how much potential power we have if we were to allow that electricity to flow from one side to the other. That's kind of the driving force behind it, is how much voltage we have. Okay, and then if we take that and we let that electricity actually flow from one side to the other, now we're talking about current, right? So this is our kinetic energy of electricity. Okay, so this is the flow of electrical charge from one point to another. So we can turn voltage, that potential energy, into current, which is kinetic energy. This is measured in amps. Okay. How many of the ladies most likely have in the dorm, sometimes using your curling iron plus your blow dryer, and all the lights go out? Does that happen in the dorms ever anymore? No, not anymore. Wow, we've upgraded all of our electrical systems. That happen at home? Okay, a little bit, yeah. Sometimes at home, yeah. This used to happen all the time in the dorms because we didn't have enough amperage in our systems in the dorm. But that's the whole idea: is every current or every circuit in your house or in a dorm, there's a bunch of plugs all plugged into one circuit in the breaker box in your house, right? And that usually has a max current of maybe 10 amps, 15 amps, 20 amps, depending on the size of that current, size of that breaker. And so if you take a blow dryer, which is usually pulls about 12 amps just by itself, take one blow dryer, someone else plugs a blow dryer in, turns it on, that's above that 20 amps that can handle, and it just shuts it off, right? Because there's too much energy flowing through it that it could potentially heat up and start a fire. So it's a safety mechanism. But that's the whole idea, is it's measuring current flow through those wires, right? And so if we add too many amps of current to that circuit, then that safety mechanism shuts it off. got to go ask your dad to open up the breaker box and flip the switch back on, right? If you've had that experience, or maybe your mom did it, maybe you did it. I don't know, but it's usually me in our house that has to do it. But, yeah, so that's the idea of amperage. Okay, this is kind of the energy in electricity is actually doing something. It's flowing towards something to do some kind of work, right? And it depends on two factors. It depends on, first of all, how much driving force did we have behind the electricity in the first place? That's our voltage. Okay, and then how much resistance to flow was there? So how many volts do we have in all these plugs around the house or around here? Anybody know? It's about 110, right? It's 110. If you go to Europe, how many is it? You guys, it's double that. All the European circuits are pretty much 220 volts. Like, for example, like your dryer at home is most likely at 220 volts, that weird looking plug, right? But some devices need more voltage, but the typical voltage in these is all about 110. Okay. Yeah, so it depends on voltage plus resistance. Okay. And so what does that actually mean in our body, right? What does current look like in neurons? Well, it's dependent on ion flow instead. Whereas in electricity, like in the wall, it's just really electron flow through that copper wire. Okay, but in our body, it's ion flow. It's ions traveling from one side of a membrane to another. Okay, and so there's a bunch of different ways that can happen. One of those ways is through passive ion channels, right? Leak channels. We talked about these when we talked about resting membrane potential. There's more leakage of potassium than there is of sodium, right? So we always have a little bit of positive charge leaking out of the inside of our cells. That's that potassium leaking out. And there's actually specific types of proteins that only allow potassium to go through, other types that only allow sodium to go through, right? So those are leak channels. That's one form of current. Okay. We also have channels that are gated by different things. One of the things that can gate a channel is called a ligand. So a ligand gated ion channel is a channel in which a certain chemical binds to it. And when it binds to it, it changes its structure in such a way that it opens it up, right? What was an example that we talked about that looked like this? Say it again. Not exactly sodium potassium. We'll talk about that one in a sec too. Just giving it away right here. Acetylcholine, right? So this is how a lot of hormones and neurotransmitters work. They bind to a receptor on the outside, and then that receptor itself changes shape and opens up. And then we said that allowed for potassium and sodium to travel, but more sodium traveled in, right? And that's what caused the depolarization on our muscle cells, right? So that acetylcholine receptor. Okay, so that chemical binds to it, that opens up the gate and allows ions to flow. Okay, so it's a ligand gated ion channel. We can also have voltage gated ion channels, right? So the voltage across the membrane affects the shape of that protein in such a way to where it can open it or close it and allow ions to flow through. Okay, so some examples of that: sodium and potassium channels. We're going to talk about these next time when we talk about how action potentials work. And then the one we've already talked about is that calcium channel on the end of our neurons that we said allows calcium to flow into the neuron, and then that causes acetylcholine release, right? That was a voltage gated ion channel too. And then we have others called mechanically gated ion channels. This is how most of our touch receptors work. So when something touches your skin, it actually just physically smashes down some stuff in your skin. And it does that in such a way that it kind of pries this little door open, right? And then allows ions to flow in. And that causes an action potential, right? And so that's a mechanically gated channel, right? So all of these are just different ways that the body has created to allow for ions to flow across membranes and to allow for electrical current in our cells. Okay. All right, so the last principle of electricity that's important in all this is resistance, right? So what's creating, what's holding back the flow of electricity? That's what resistance is. So hindrance to current. Okay, and we kind of already talked about this a little bit, but this idea of an insulator versus a conductor. An insulator is something with a lot of resistance. Okay, it doesn't let current flow. So like we talked about, this is plastic around wires, right, which is shown here. We got some plastic on the inner wires, also got some plastic on that outer wire. That's what the wire inside of the walls typically looks like, right? It's that 3 different wires wrapped in a couple different things that are good insulators, right? But in our neurons, it's lipids instead of plastic. Okay, but then good conductors have very low resistance. Okay, so some examples there: metal like we see here, or water like we see inside of our axons. Okay, so then really the way to put all this together is this thing called Ohm's law. Okay, so Ohm's law is how we get current. So current equals voltage divided by resistance. All right, so how much flowing electricity is dictated by the power of the push behind the electricity. That was the voltage. And then how much resistance to flow there is. Okay, you can kind of think about it like a hose, right? So we think about a hose, the volts are really kind of how high you turn that faucet on, right? And how much water pressure you have driving behind it. Okay, the ohms, which is the measurement of resistance, is the size of the hose. Right, you got a really skinny hose, there's a lot of resistance in that, but you got a big fat hose, there's not much resistance at all, right? And then the amps are really how much water is actually flowing out, right? Dictated both by how hard it's getting pushed from behind and how much room there is for water to flow through, right? So same idea with electricity. Okay, so we're going to kind of talk about this, how this makes sense for what we're going to lead up to next time, which is talking about action potentials. And so we talked about this recently, but this idea of the flow of ions across the membrane is electricity, and that's going to rely on two things, right? And the first one of those things is the chemical gradient, right? So this is how much of the ion do we have on one side versus the other, right? And that ion's always going to want to move in the direction of high to low, right? Wherever we got a lot of it, it's going to want to move towards the side where we don't have much of it, right? And so, yeah, so it's going to move high to low, right? So that's the concentration piece. That's a chemical gradient. But then since these are charged particles, we have to also think about their electrical gradient, right? And this is why when I asked you that question last time, or a couple times ago, about which of the two has a stronger push, sodium or potassium, right? We kind of worked it out to figure that sodium does, because the inside of the cell is negative, right? So its electrical gradient is pulling it in, whereas potassium is getting pushed out from the chemical gradient, but actually getting pulled back in from the electrical gradient, right? So this is always going to move towards the opposite charge. Okay, so we have to think about both of those factors when we think about how much of an ion is going to flow across the membrane at any given time if we allow it to flow. Okay, so let's look at two potential scenarios here. All right, so if we just kind of picture our resting membrane potential where we have sodium and potassium, right, on either side of the membrane, which side do we have a lot of sodium on, inside or outside? Guys remember? In or out? Talk to each other for a second. Let's make sure we're on the same page there. Where do we have a lot of sodium? Where do we have a lot of potassium? All right, so what do we decide? Where's our sodium? A lot of outside or inside? Outside, lots of sodium outside. Then where's most of our potassium? Inside. Perfect. That's absolutely right. So if we have this potential scenario where we just open up the membrane to sodium only, we just open up a bunch of sodium channels, which way is sodium going to go? In or out? In, okay. Because of which gradient, the chemical or the electrical? Both, absolutely, right? Absolutely both, okay? Because we have a concentration gradient, there's a lot of sodium outside, not much inside, so the chemical gradient is going to push it. We got a negative charge inside the cell. Sodium's positive, opposites attract, is going to pull it in, right? So we got that strong push for sodium, okay? If we just let it go until it found its equilibrium, would it balance out on both sides of the membrane? No, it would not, okay? But as sodium rushes in, what happens to our membrane potential? If it was negative 70, what's it going to do? Move in which direction? More negative or more positive? More positive, right? Because we're adding a positively charged ion to the space that's negatively charged. So it's going to move in the positive direction. This is known as depolarization. Okay. Yeah, so then does it actually equal out, right? Actually, the balance for sodium would occur around, positive 66 millivolts. Okay, so meaning that it would go all the way from negative 70 all the way up to positive 66 if we were allowed, if sodium was able to actually equal out on both sides. Okay, so if we have the same amount, same actual concentration of sodium on both sides, we would end up with a positive 66. Our membranes never really get that high. Membrane potential never gets that high. Even with an action potential, it gets up to around maybe positive 40. Okay, but what happens as sodium starts leaving the cell to the electrical gradient? As we're getting more positive on the inside, right? Sorry, as sodium's coming in, as we're getting more positive, we're starting to lose our electrical gradient, right? It's starting to get more positive on the inside. So we get this positive charge built up on the inside, which then that is pushing sodium back. Right? And we're also losing our chemical gradient too, right? As it's coming in, we're losing our chemical gradient and we're also losing our electrical gradient because the inside of the cell is becoming more positive and because we're starting to get more sodium on the inside, even though we still have more on the outside. Okay, so we don't reach this actual equalization point because of that charge difference that occurs. Okay, so that's the situation for sodium. And then if we did the same thing for potassium, okay, we just opened up potassium channels and nothing else. First of all, which way would it go? In or out? It's going to go out, right? Because we got a lot of it on the inside, not much on the outside. Okay, so we have a chemical gradient pushing it. But as we said before, this is going against the electrical gradient. Okay, so would it balance out on both sides of the membrane? Again, no, it wouldn't, right? So as it's going out, what's happening to the membrane potentials? Is it getting more positive or more negative? The inside of the cell is losing a positively charged ion. So is that making our go more negative or more positive? More negative, absolutely. Okay. So what happens to membrane potential as it's going out? It's becoming more negative. Okay. And its balance occurs around negative 96 millivolts. Okay, so it's much closer to its kind of like balancing point. Okay, and why doesn't it actually balance out? Because as it's going out, there's positive charge building up on the outside, but also a stronger negative charge on the inside, so it's pulling it back even harder, right? And the positive charge is pushing it back. All right, so this electrical gradient changes pretty rapidly as potassium is leaving or as sodium is entering. Okay, so then think about this question a little bit here and go ahead and answer this first one, but then also talk about those two questions there. If at least the first one, I'll help you out with the second one.
Yeah. So once you have both gradients working. Yeah, which is.
All right, so A or B, which of the two ions is closer to its equilibrium point? When we're at resting membrane potential is really what the question should say. When we're at that negative 70, which one's closer to its kind of equilibrium point that it would just stop flowing? So go ahead and send that in, a few more of you. Okay, good. So we got mostly everybody. So we got about 85% of you saying B, potassium. Okay, so as potassium starts leaving the cell, it drives our resting membrane potential down to about negative 96. Right, so it only has about 26 millivolts to go because we start at negative 70, whereas sodium could drive it all the way up to positive 66. So that's, almost 140, right? 136 or something millivolts difference, right? So potassium is pretty close actually to its equilibrium point. And which of the two had more passive leakage? That we talked about? Which one? This was one of the reasons for resting membrane potential, right? One was a sodium potassium pump, how it pumps sodium and potassium unequally, right? Three potassiums out, two sodiums in, and then it was also the negatively charged proteins, and then the third one was more passive leakage of potassium. Yeah, so potassium has more passive leakage, so it means we're always losing a little bit more of a positively charged ion, which keeps us negative on the inside. Okay, and so that kind of is connected because we're closer to the equilibrium point for potassium because we always have more potassium leaking out, right? So that's kind of, it's getting itself closer to where it wants to be because there's always some of it leaking out. And so the reason this is so important for action potentials is because the sodium gradient is very strong, right? That push against sodium to go into the cell is very strong because of the chemical gradient and the electrical gradient. And this is what's responsible for the first part of the action potential, which is called depolarization. And we'll talk about that next class. But depolarization is driven by sodium rushing into the cell in about a half a millisecond. So very, very rapidly because it's got such a strong push. All right, we're done. Have a great rest of your day. We'll see you guys on Friday.
Thank you, Dr.
All right. See you later.